Ladies and gentlemen, this is the 12th and final round.
Right hand, Golovkin steps in and down he goes again. Unbelievable. Mayweather makes a pay. What a rookie mistake. A sensational left hook by De La Hoya.
It's fact. I'm the best. You know what I mean? Sometimes I don't want to believe it myself, but it's the truth. I'm the best.
I'm going to show you how great I am.
From Southern California, this is the Last Round Podcast.
Welcome to another bonus edition of the Last Round Podcast. Thank you again for joining us. This week, we have the co-founder and publisher at Hamilcar Publications, Book Publications, and HannibalBoxing.com, which is also Hannibal Boxing Media. Kyle Sarofeen joins us here on the Last Round. Thank you for joining us, Kyle.
Hey guys, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So, you know, for people, obviously, a lot of hardcore boxing fans are familiar with your publishing company. There's a lot of books. Like we were just talking just before we started recording about Tris Dixon. He writes, a lot of books that you guys, publish for him. And, we were just talking about him as a writer and then his podcast, Boxing Life Stories. But you yourself, how did you get started in, I guess, would you call it the boxing game or would you call it the book publishing game?
Yeah, that's an awesome question, Danny. Because I tell people like book. I'm not married, but like books are like my wife, and like boxing is my mistress. You know what I mean? Like I worked in publishing houses in Boston. I live just outside of Boston since my late 20s. And I was always a boxing fan. And when I worked, for those publishing companies, I wasn't an editor, what's called a acquisitions editor, or, publisher is sort of like in charge of a whole program, which obviously I am now. But the idea sort of occurred to me maybe like 8 or 9 years ago, sort of combine the two things. And I wanted to publish books, and it's hard to kind of transition to the other side in a business if you're like a production person, and so I kind of figured I knew that I would have to do my own business to do that. And the genesis of the boxing stuff was I was a fan since my teens. And I was a real, really into sports when I was young. But after about the age of 20, boxing's like the one sport that really captured my interest, sort of late 80s, early 90s and beyond. And I knew that I knew more about it than people that I was working with in publishing houses, which no one knew anything about it, And it's weird. Like I'll give you a good story. Like, this is like 2009, 2010. And looking back, it's funny because I was working at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt on the Curious George books, right? I was buying like the printing of the Curious George books, right? And I was reading like Carlos, who's my author now, on like Max Boxing. And, I remember like Steve Kim was writing Max Boxing back then, and I'm also into hip hop. One of our books combined boxing and hip hop, and I literally had my headphones on, like listening to underground hip hop and reading about fights and kind of handling the Curious George stuff too. It all kind of came together. 10 years later, here I am. But that's I kind of took what I knew in terms of the nuts and bolts of how to put a book together, which I handle all our stuff end to end, what's called manuscript to bound book. Like most people who are like in my position, like a publisher, don't do that. You know what I mean? Like nuts and bolts, typesetting, copy editing, proofreading, printing. So I had that background, and I think actually it's sort of a thing in publishing where people who know the subject can be editors, like someone who's an expert on gardening and isn't in publishing could publish gardening books because they know what the good books are, they know good subjects, they know who the good writers are. So Actually, the technical piece, which I already had under my belt, was kind of the most valuable, and then kind of took it from there. And I started with my high school friend, like going on 5 years ago. He left the business in January, sort of like amicably, just wanted to get off the entrepreneurial treadmill a bit. So it's just me now, but he was a huge part of building it with me. His name's Andy Comack, and obviously it's stressful being an entrepreneur, but it was a hell of a ride, and it was great to take it for the first 4 years with my really good friend, and now take it forward myself.
You mentioned that you became a fan of the sport, in the 80s and 90s. I mean, who were some of the, like, I guess, the fighters or the personalities around that time that kind of drew you in to be a fan?
Yeah, well, I was born in 71, right? So I grew up in the 80s and started watching Hagler fights when I was 10, right? Because I watched everything, Red Sox, Patriots, Celtics, that like the Celtics, but it's really into basketball. But like Hagler was almost like the fifth sports franchise in Boston, right? So back then there was no Sports Center. It was just like the three, ABC, NBC, CBS, like 5-minute sports thing at the end of the newscast, the evening news. And like, they would always have Hagler stories. And the cool thing back then, as you guys know too, is there were more fights on TV and also the matinees, right? So as a 10, 11, 12-year-old kid, like it wasn't, like most of them weren't pay-per-view, right? Like Hagler was fighting on TV
right
during the day. Boom Boom Mancini, Aaron Pryor, Arguello, all those fights. I grew up as sort of like a sports obsessed kid watching that stuff.
What was the first event you ever attended?
It's funny. That's a really good question. I think it was 2000. It was late, 2009. Chad Dawson, Glenn Johnson in Hartford.
Oh, wow.
Which I think, I'm trying to remember. I went to some Golden Glove stuff when I was really young, right? But like first pro fight, I think that was the one. And I've been at maybe 10 since that. But I think that was actually the first one because, the thing is if you think about like around that time, like 2010, 9, Murphy's Boxing started having a lot of cards,
right?
Up in Boston, right? But before that, there was like a Ricky Hatton fight at the Garden, maybe. But there were like no fights in Boston for like a long time, So, but yeah, subsequently I saw like Teofimo Lopez at the Garden when he beat Comey, and a bunch of other ones. I guess now I don't remember all of them because I've been to a lot of fights, but yeah, going to the first one, there's nothing like it too, of course, right?
Right.
Like it's just nothing like watching a fight on TV. It's electric, amazing.
How did you settle on the name Hannibal Boxing?
Yeah, I'm really I'm less into cigars than I used to be, but I still smoke them. And I was really into cigars for a while. And I went to business school like my early 40s, and I was thinking about all these business ideas like are centered around my passions, right? One of which was cigars. And I came across these vintage cigar labels, like a whole set, and it was Hannibal cigars, like the Carthaginian general, obviously not Lecter, right? The guy with the elephant off the Romans. And my father had talked about Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general, when I was a kid, because I'm Lebanese, right? And he was Carthaginian. Carthage was a Phoenician colony, so like I had the cigar art, and like we were bootlegging at the beginning, man. Like we didn't even have a graphic designer, so we actually used the first iteration of the Hannibal logo is like was the actual cigar art, and the what it is now is like a improved version of that our designer did. So like we were bootstrapping, like the Hannibal site, I wrote like the first 10 pieces just because we didn't have any writers, like we really started from the ground up, and like we were thinking about maybe just doing journalism. And my business partner, Andy, he had like a digital marketing background. So it didn't even, oddly, it's really strange to think about. And, because we put out like 20 books in 3 years. But in the beginning, like it wasn't even necessarily going to be publishing. And then a few months into it, I said, hey, that's my background. Let's publish some books, like passive income, that we were, everyone, I was sort of into that from some business books that I read. And I was like, Jesus, like the business I know is that scalable kind of business, especially with digital books.
What was the first book that was published, Carl, and how did you decide on it? Did you decide, this is the perfect book, you want to make a splash, you want to get like one first impression, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, it wasn't that deliberate. Actually, like, we wanted to get a book out, and the way to do that in the publishing business typically is to either find a manuscript that's already written, and at that time we didn't have any connections with anyone really, agents or any of that stuff. So I came across a Ron Lyle biography that had been published in the UK, and I was a big Ron Lyle fan. Like knew his story, had watched him in the documentary Facing Ali. I knew him from Lyle Foreman, but in that documentary, he's just like totally compelling, like charismatic, and I love that doc. And I kind of remembered him from that. And I was looking around, and I just noticed that this book had been published in the UK and hadn't been published over here. So we approached the UK publisher and did a deal. We didn't know what we were doing at all. Basically put together like a marketing plan, and it was sort of like off to the races. Then we did Jacob's Beach, similar fashion, acquired the rights to that. And then I think what kind of like made us, to a degree, I think in helped us recruit authors was reissuing Dark Trade in the US, Don McRae's book. And I think after that, it was kind of off to the races. People took us seriously. We got our feet wet. We put James Toney on the cover. He's my favorite fighter, without question. Commissioned a painting for that. I think like, that I think Dark Trade was kind of like the what you're talking about, like the statement sort of book, and Don's reputation, being connected with him helped us. And then I think we signed Chris Giudice to write Macho Time, and we're Todd Snyder to write Bundini. Came up with the Noir series, and it was kind of rolling from there.
They've both been on. We did book reviews with both of those guys.
Yeah, it's interesting too. Like I think let's see. Well, Sporting Blood was our first original full-length book. Carlos is obviously coming out with The Duke, right? And that came out. Sporting Blood came out in March of 2020, right? Not a auspicious time to pub your first book, but Carlos's writing is so good. That book has really had legs. It's like top 2 or 3 for us, and we're coming out with The Duke, and I think that The Duke is going to blow people away. I think it's an all-time great boxing book. I think it's up there with any of the classics, and I think we've actually come out with a couple classics before this book, Damage and the War, Tris Dixon's Damage and John Stradley's The War, and I feel like, you know, we're coming back really strong with this book.
Carl, let's use the Duke. Obviously, that's the one that's coming out now. Let's use that for an example. I've obviously never written a book, and I'm pretty sure Danny's never written a book. So, what is the usual process, dude? Did they approach you about writing a book on Tommy Morrison, or do you get like an idea? Do you approach an author that you think will be perfect? Could you just go from like A to Z for us?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Typically, like Carlos Azevedo, Don Stradley, are basically writers that I'm not going to say that I discovered them, right? But they both wrote for Hannibal. Like Hannibal served as like a recruiting mechanism for authors, right? Like I read Carlos for years, so he was the editor of Hannibal, and I just said, hey, let's do a book. And we did Sporting Blood, and we're friends, and we talked a lot. So it's almost like a partnership. And with the Morrison idea, you know, we're sort of bouncing around different ideas. Obviously, one of the main things that Hamilcar has done is weave boxing with sort of elements of you know, darker elements, right? And, you know, we had a few ideas, but I think, you know, the Tommy Morrison story is a hell of a story. You know, ESPN did the 30 for 30 on it. Like it's made, you know, there was no book on him, you know, and a documentary isn't a book and a book isn't a documentary. So I think it, you know, it was sort of like a natural choice. You know, I think that the way that I look at books too, guys, is it's entertainment, right? I have no illusions. I'm not like, you know, when I was in my 20s, you know, I read the Paris Review and Granta and you know, the New York Times Book Review, and you know, I was, and to a degree still am, a literary person, but the way that I've approached the you know, Hamilcar and building our list is really to entertain people. So you know, I think people are entertained by things like tragic stories, true crime, things like that. And we just didn't want to, you know, straight boxing is good, but I think it's more interesting to weave in other elements and dimensions to stories.
What would you say the similarities and differences are between a journalism piece, since you have HannibalBoxing.com, and writing within an actual book?
Yeah, that's an awesome question, Danny. I think that you know, obviously after a while, especially when you become a legitimate publisher and people know you get submissions all the time, which is flattering, and like I reply to everyone typically, is, you know, unless I miss an email or something. But I think a lot of people think that they can just write a book, and writing a book it's a very serious undertaking. You know, I think that, you know, the best authors are at the same time professional researchers, and it takes a certain personality to stick with something like that long. I think there's like a real work ethic there, and I would say conceptually the work is harder, right, in terms of telling a story over the course of 200 pages. Like Don Stradley like lives in the next town over from me, which is pretty unusual. You know, we have authors in the UK, LA, you name it, right? So I get coffee, beers with him, dinner. My best friend, it's crazy. It's like my best friend lives across the street from him, right? So like we talk for hours about different book projects and sort of like the thoughtfulness that he puts into each book, you know, and how he's going to tell the story. Like it's a lot of effort, you know. It's its own thing, and it's hard work, you know.
Kyle, what made you decide on, boxing, true crime, and hip hop? Us boxing nerds probably, will know why, but for people that don't realize, why did you choose those three?
Yeah, that's my main interests. Pretty well, I'm not going to say that like true crime is my main interest, but like who doesn't like true crime stories, right? If people are being honest with themselves, and I think after a while, like just in terms of what I like to read, I'll read weightier stuff, but I think in terms of entertainment, you kind of can't go wrong. Obviously we're sort of like a male brand. I hate to say that, use that sort of expression, but like I like watching documentaries about crime, gangsters. Who doesn't? Like I think most guys do, and I think and then I think with boxing and hip hop, right? Those two things go together like peanut butter and jelly because boxing's more urban. I just had a conversation with like my distributor as like an in-house marketing agency that I'm starting to use now, and we were talking. I had a meeting with them this week, and the guy's like brilliant who heads this up. He's like one of the biggest sort of digital marketing. I don't know. Anyway, he was talking about like hot spots and like I said, look, man, like in terms of geography, like look at the presidential election map. Like that's where boxing is, And I think that's what kind of hip hop is too when they go together. You know what I mean? Just like UFC might go together with who knows what, like country music or I don't know, a little bit or metal, right? Like listen to I've corresponded with, and he was interviewed for our book. Beatboxing is what's his name? The DJ for Top Rank, Hoffman. First name escapes me, but I basically sent him a fan letter. I was like, man, he's like spinning like Gangstar and like House of Pain, like between rounds, and it just goes together.
Oh, and
it's all stuff I like, guys. Basically.
Kyle, like looking, because obviously a lot of the books that your company has published over the years and continues to publish are about we talked about true crime, hip hop, and obviously boxing, and then focusing on boxing, a lot of them are about old school fighters, some of them who aren't with us anymore, Macho Camacho and stuff like that.
Right.
This is kind of like a hypothetical question, but like looking at the landscape now, or maybe like the last 15 years of boxers and fighters that have come through the rankings, not like in a crime, true crime way, but is there any fighter that you think, okay, maybe in 10 years or another 20 years, I think we can write a book on this guy's life?
That's an awesome question. I've gotten that question before. And I basically answered no, because you don't know, right? Like you have to, like the good example, because we're doing a James Toney's bio right now, right? And it's being written. And when I was asked that question before, I said, look, like 2003 when he beats Jirov and Holyfield, right? If that doesn't happen, there's no book.
Right.
Right? You have to have like a certain arc to a story. You know what I mean? So like that's kind of like the fascinating thing too with boxing, right? Like someone gets knocked out brutally, like no book. Like maybe, there's still going to be I think actually Manny Pacquiao did a book, right? I don't know if it came out, but he did get KO'd like that. But you know what I'm saying? Like I have to think that after Ruiz beat Anthony Joshua, like sales of his book in the UK, like like, yeah. So it's a good question. I don't have an answer to that.
What about in terms of an event? Is there any event that, because sometimes when there's like a singular event, you can, because there's so many intricate details in one singular event, you can do a book on that. I mean, we've seen it in numerous topics.
Like the war, I guess, like a second book of the war.
Yeah. It's I think Gaddy Ward was done.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not mistaken. Someone did write a fight we did write a book on the Gaddy Ward fights. Man, I don't. It's a good question. I don't have an answer to that. It's interesting. It's easier to sort of go back 20 years.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Is there any book or any topic that your company or your authors have explored in wanting to write about, publish a book about, but you guys weren't able to because maybe the fighter or the fighter's family or the fighter's estate or anything, couldn't give you any type of authorization or kind of give you some pushback?
Usually it's interesting because that's a good question. Not really. No. We have a very good lawyer. Best publishing lawyers in the country. He vets everything. In one case, in the Camacho book, we left someone out who didn't want to be in the book. And it's kind of funny to, like, I think someone in a review, they're like, oh, well, it didn't talk about so-and-so at all. I was like, well, there's a very good reason for that. You're a sharp reader. So I guess not really. Like with James's book, we wanted his participation, so we kind of did the deal with him and the author. I think in one case we just had to sort of remove someone, from a book that didn't want to be in it. But aside from that, we just kind of keep it moving. Also, like, I don't know, like an agent wants, like, I'm actually publishing the first straight true crime book November. Dodd Stradley's writing it. It has nothing to do with boxing. It's about a murder in Boston in the 80s. But before that, we're sort of thinking about doing straight true crime, and an agent who's actually a good friend, but he I don't know, he pitched like a tell-all by a hitman, and I dug into it a little bit. It's like, I was like, I don't want to touch this thing with a 10-foot pole or a 20-foot, 50-foot pole, right? Because I don't know, it was sort of like a billionaire involved who was, supposedly a gangster, but it looked the guy up. He's like never been charged with anything. It's like, yeah, I don't want to do anything close to this, And put it this way, like the Russian mafia and their involvement with boxing, forget it. Nothing. You won't see any Russian mafia books from Hamilcar Publications.
How many books up until this point, as of today, have you guys published in total?
I think it's 19, 20. We have like 3, 4, 5, 6 being written. So I think we're around 20, and it's going to be 25. So pretty quick. The thing in publishing that you kind of want to do is sort of like the magic number is like 100 books. You build like what's called a backlist. And historically, like 60%, any established publisher who's been around for a while, like 60, sometimes even 70% of their revenue is backlist. And once that happens, you're golden. It's like a gift that keeps on giving, but you have to get there. And to get there, you have to have a couple hits, which I think that's one thing that I've learned as well. Is all the books that we're coming out with from now on are ones that I can hit a home run with. I think in the beginning, like it was singles, doubles, maybe even a triple, but kind of swinging for the fences with every one pretty much.
Right.
Within reason, like there are certain books that round out the portfolio, which I think is important, So yeah, and we're getting into music. We're actually doing a book about the Doors, the band The Doors.
Sweet. Yeah.
Out in November, and then the same author. We haven't announced it yet, but we're gonna do a trilogy: Stones, Zeppelin, and The Doors.
That's cool. That's cool.
Some big names.
Yeah, like especially with the Stones, like I'm 51, like I kind of got into them again the last 3-4 years. You know how that happens with music, that you listen to it so much when you're young, you don't hear it anymore, and then you hit your 40s or your 50s, and I don't know, it sounds fresh again. And that could be with any genre. And I want to do some hip hop books as well. We have a book coming out actually in next year. It's called From Boom Bap to Trap, Hip Hop's Greatest Producers. Author's name is Riley Wallace. It's illustrated, and that one I'm really psyched about. RZA, DJ Premier, Muggs, Dre, you name it, and a lot of underground guys. It's pretty. It's kind of fun. I think the thing is too, is like with the program, like I've been talking to Tris about doing another book. We have an idea, and I'd like to do that whenever he's ready. And then we have James's bio coming out, and that's like a dream project for me. He's my favorite fighter. Actually got to hang out with him several times, which you haven't lived until you've hung out with Dan Tony and his crew.
Lights out, huh?
Yeah, the thing with him is, I don't have to tell you about James Toney, right? Like just all time great. But he's a terrific person. He's like a really, really good guy. I can't wait to wrap that book up and get it out. But the thing is in terms of the other stuff I talked about, like I am kind of branching out. I feel like I've almost done, I've done a lot with boxing books, right? And I feel like it filled a gap. It's created like a body of work for fans to kind of read now and going forward. But I do want to branch out, kind of get into some other categories as well.
Now, Kyle, do you in terms of the publishing side, do you guys publish a physical copy of the book, but do you guys also do digital and then possibly like a narration, a voice narration?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. Like I use I'm exclusive with Amazon, which is pretty advantageous business wise. They're sort of like the evil empire, but their ebook program is pretty fair, and it's kind of interesting in terms of like the data and all that you can see. But so in audiobooks, I license them. There's one company that I'm sort of working with now, and they've done maybe 3 of our books so far, and they're interested in a couple. Just emailed with them today, so pretty much all audio, ebook, and obviously print. I have like major distribution through a company called Two Rivers, which is owned by Ingram, who's the biggest book wholesaler in the country. So they're small and they're terrific. Two Rivers. I have a lot of firepower behind me, which is great on the print side. Like the books are in Barnes and Noble, Waterstones in the UK. My distributor, they took us on right around the time that we did Dark Trade, and they really took a chance on us. We had 3 books, and for example, they distribute like Zagat, Harvard Business Review Press, and all that. So, it's nice to kind of, our books are kind of, as they say, like available wherever books are sold, like they really are.
Right. Kyle, is there anybody that stands out in your mind in terms of, the voice, like a memorable voice that they have that you think, if you had the chance, like, man, if I can get that person to narrate one of our books or one specific book that pops in your mind, is there anybody that comes to mind?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. We had this guy, his name is Chris Shula. He's like a boxing guy, and he actually narrated Don Stradley's Slaughter in the Streets, which is like about Boston organized crime and boxers who got killed and stuff. And I'm partial to him a little bit just because of like the local Boston accent. But that's a good question. Kriegel, I like Kriegel's. I don't know if he would narrate a book, but I like Kriegel's narration for like the little pieces that he does for ESPN. He's a cool guy.
Yeah, you know what? Kriegel's a good choice too. He's been on the show before, and like you said, he does all the narration for those, small 1 to 2 minute pieces for ESPN during these fights. So,
I love stuff. I love that stuff. Yeah, he's blurbed a couple of books. I sent him books. I've talked to him a couple times. He's a really good guy.
The reason I asked is because obviously the thing that popped into my mind was when HBO was still in the boxing business, they obviously had a lot of success with the HBO 24/7 documentaries that they did leading up to these fights, and they had the actor, I forgot, his name skips my mind.
Yeah, Driver, the guy who
yes.
played what's his name? The Boston.
Yeah, he's been in a bunch of movies, X-Men and all that stuff. But he, to me, as as a boxing fan, and he still does narration for HBO and others, but I associate his name with a lot of boxing stuff because watching those 24/7s,
It's funny about the 24/7s is some people, and like even friends of mine, like or whatever, some of our writers like have said that they didn't like them, or they were like infomercials and stuff. I liked them. I thought they were great. I thought the writing was good, and also like the cinematography and all that. I know that Greg Bishop's a friend, and he's blurbed our books, and I send him books and stuff. And I think he's writing for Showtime now with some of those things. So, that's the thing. It's like, and I think back in the day, like with the 24/7, like I didn't realize, like, all right, like this once in a while, there's like a turn of phrase in those little docs. It's just like, holy shit, like that's poetic. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But they have like serious writers like writing it. It's not just like a hack doing it. It's like people with like real talent, which I don't know, made sense to me later, when I figured it out.
Do you have any, in terms of the current landscape for, I guess, writers, respected writers from your view in the world of boxing right now? Is there anybody right now that, you admire their work and you find them pretty credible?
I I would say right now, my favorite boxing writers are Hamilcar authors, pretty much, right? Or at least have done a book with me, right? Like McRae, Carlos, Tris, Stradley. trying to think. I'd like to do a book with Greg Bishop. I'd like to do, he's one I haven't done a book with him, but I'd like to do a book with him. No question. Maybe Kriegel too. I don't know if I can afford him.
Yeah, what are the difficulties, Kyle, in, let's just say a journalism writer or a reporter who writes pieces for a website, digital newspaper, or anything of that nature, but they've always wanted to kind of write some type of book. How do you transition from writing daily pieces about, let's just say, boxing news or profile pieces or something like that, to transitioning to writing an actual like novel or autobiography or book?
It's interesting. I kind of went through that experience with Patrick Connor, who runs Boxing History and is a friend, and we had I don't know if he had the Bonavina idea, shot at a brothel, and he hadn't written a book before, and man, he obviously as an editor, I'm pretty hands-on, and we worked through some drafts, and he did like an incredible job. You know what I mean? And he kind of taught it. Like, basically, if you haven't written a book before, you have to teach yourself how to write a book. And part of that is just, if you're a journalist, think about like a chapter, because like basically, like if you're writing like 1,000 or 2,000 word pieces, like that's a chapter, right? So it's almost like stringing, say like two, I don't know, in terms of like word count, like, you got to get to 50, 60,000 words, right? So you're writing, in some cases, and I know that some guys have done it like this who haven't written books. It kind of is like, okay, well, I'm just writing like 15 feature pieces and kind of putting them together. And I think that that's the way you do it, right? Because it's sort of like, how do I say? Like you're biting it off in chunks. You're not like trying to take the whole thing on at once. I think that's a good way to kind of do it, So I think, and that's kind of how, you just write like 5,000 words at a time, and then kind of put it all together. And I know with Don Stradley, especially, right, because he's written this book that's coming out in November, is his 5th book. He'd written like a short book on like, I can't remember what, for Scholastic. It was like a YA sports book, but he really hadn't written, like narrative, non-literary nonfiction, right? And I know through my conversations with him, like a lot of it's just, get through the first one. It's like stringing a bunch of pieces together, and then you get better at like stringing those pieces together, right? And you get better at conceptualizing the whole thing and banging out sections. But a lot of guys like bang out sections like they're long journalism pieces and then put them together like puzzles and stuff, And there's no one way to do it. It's like I think different guys have different methods, but that's, it's and I know, put it this way, like in terms of the editing process, it's messy. It's not always clean, like some authors like really deliver stuff that's basically ready to go, right? I edit the books. I have a copy editor who edits the books, 2 passes. I do like 2 passes. She does a pass. Some books are like, I don't know, Frankenstein is the way to, like you're really like, I'm really getting my hands dirty and collaborating with the author. And that's the thing too, is like books are, it's one thing I learned like very, very early on in my career, just working in publishing houses. And I don't know if people know this completely, right? But it's really a team effort, right? Between a lot of different people.
How many people would you say it's because obviously it's not just you and the author. It's you, the author, a copy editor, you
Yep.
know.
Proofreader, typesetter, graphic designer who designs the interior. And in my case, my designer designs everything. His name is Brad Knorr, by the way. He's a huge part of Hamilcar. He designs everything. And he's a friend, amazing designer. So he really is like a collaborator with me too. And then, it is really a team. Yeah. So all those people that I mentioned, a printer, I have a couple people. Carlos reads all of our books and gives me feedback. Charles Farrell does. He's a good friend. He wrote Low Life. He reads most of the books, gives me feedback. I bounce. It's like I'm not a self-help business person, but like the Napoleon Hill, like the brain trust. You know what I mean? Like I kind of have a brain trust editorially. But yeah, like the main manuscript to bound book process or acquisitions to bound book is, acquire the manuscript, and you have copy editor, typesetter, proofreader, printer, and then the designer, obviously, before the typesetter and doing the cover. So 6, 7, 8 people. Then you have marketing people, 9, 10. It's a lot of people,
A lot of moving parts, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing too. It's like it's a team effort in terms of catching everything too, right? Like my proofreader is like unbelievable, right? And she still misses things occasionally, right? And I know I do. You have to have like multiple eyes on a book to like really, really get it right.
If let's just say a prospective author wanted to, get into that world or write a book and they wanted to approach you, what do you look for? Do you look for obviously writing samples? What would you tell that prospective author? Like, okay, what do you got? Let me see what you got.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that my, because in the beginning it really was, I don't know. It's like in sort of legitimate trade book publishing with, especially like the big 5, right? Like Penguin Random House, Hachette, and all of them. Like they're not even going to sign anyone unless they have 10,000 Twitter followers or 20 or 100,000. It's called like the platform, and publishing really is like sort of most quote unquote big time publishing or legitimate mainstream, the books are in Barnes and Noble publishers, like they're looking for platform, and I haven't really done that as much. I've gone for the writers and the stories, like Tris Dixon. Dixon has a huge platform, you know what I mean? But like Stradley didn't when we signed him. Carlos is kind of active on social a little bit, but I don't care. You know what I mean? Like those guys can write. So it's a combination of things. Like if you're a tremendous writer, then I'd like to work on the platform with them. You know what I mean? Help them build it more. And part of that's coming out with books. I think the main thing is the pros, you can see it right away. You know what I mean? You just can. I can. If the idea is really good, I'm sort of getting away from this because it's difficult. If the idea is really, really good, I might work with someone, between my copy editor and me. And I've done that. And hey, all writers aren't, like can write like Carlos can, for example, or Stradley or Triss, or like, you know, it's you kind of, it's a combination of things, but for me now, there has to be like a baseline level of prose, and the idea has to be really good, and that's pretty much it, you know.
Right. Well, I mean, you know, what do the fans, I guess, have to look forward to in Hamilcar Publications going forward? You know, how do you determine your goals, actually, you know, for your company? Do you go by long-term goals? Do you do like short goals, like back to back? You know, how do you look at the landscape?
That's interesting. Honestly, I take one book at a time and try to hit a home run with every book. And I think that what's kind of separated Hamilcar is that I control everything from end to end, editorially and design wise, and I put everything I have into every book. And I think that's what people have sort of responded to. Like, you know, people, you know, a lot of big publishers that, you know, mid-size, like whatever, you know, they put out good books, but like for me, it's like my life, you know what I mean? It's like life and death, if you will, like every book. And so I take one book at a time, honestly, you know. I just, you know, my goal is to get a hit, you know, and move to Nice on the on the French Riviera.
That's the goal, huh? Yeah.
Drink prosecco, you know, while you know, but it's one book at a time. You know, the analogy is like a fighter, like every book is like a training camp, and I don't look beyond like the next book, you know, a little bit in terms of like branching out into other categories, right? But that's pretty much it.
Well, on that note, you know, on that boxing analogy, I think that's a good way to conclude our conversation with you, Kyle. You know, obviously we appreciate your time. We know you're on the East Coast. We're on the West Coast, so it's a little earlier over here in California, but we definitely appreciate you staying up for us and giving us your valuable time. Obviously, go ahead and plug anything you got upcoming. You guys have the Tommy Morrison book upcoming. You know, you guys have your social media handles. Go ahead. The floor is yours.
Yeah, I think most folks, you know, Hannibal Boxing's the journalism site, Hamilcar publishing site. I just really like to plug the Duke. You know, I think this, as I said earlier, I think this is an all-time great boxing book. You know, it's up there with, you know, Carlos doesn't like me to say it, but I think it's up there with Liebling. You know, I'd rather read Carlos than Liebling, you know. And, you know, that may sound a little immodest, but I cannot wait for this book to drop because it's going to blow people away.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, we've gotten a few books from you guys. You know, we definitely appreciate that you guys send it to us. And, you know,
I have your addresses, right? So I'll stick a couple copies of the Duke in the mail tomorrow.
Yeah, that'd be sweet. Yeah, that'd be sweet. We definitely appreciate that. You know, like I said, we have your authors on all the time. You know, when the books come out, they come on, they review the books with them, and you know, they talk about it to kind of, you know, get into the masses of the boxing listeners, especially if it's a boxing book. You know, that's your audience right there. That's who you want it to buy. But once again, we appreciate your valuable time, Kyle. You know, you're more than welcome to jump on anytime you want. I'm sure we'll have you on again in the future.
Appreciate it, guys. Thanks a lot.
You take care.
Thanks for supporting and listening to the show. Follow us at The Last Round 12 on social media. Rate, review, and subscribe. This is The Last Round Podcast.